There is a phone call that happens between Islamabad and Riyadh that no journalist has ever recorded, no diplomat has ever officially confirmed, and no government has ever publicly acknowledged. It happens on a secure line that was installed decades ago. It bypasses every normal channel of communication between the two governments. It does not go through the foreign ministry. It does not go through the embassy. It does not go through any of the official diplomatic infrastructure that exists between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. It goes directly from one room to another room, from one person to another person. And when that call is made, it means something very specific. It means the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is calling in a debt, not a financial debt, not a political favor, a strategic debt, a blood debt, a commitment made decades ago in a language that both sides understand perfectly and that neither side has ever spoken about in public. That call was made 11 days ago, and what it set into motion is the single most dangerous escalation in the Iran crisis that has occurred to date, more dangerous than the NATO interception over Turkey, more dangerous than the American strikes, more dangerous than any proxy attack or missile exchange or naval confrontation in the Gulf. Because this escalation does not add another conventional military to the equation, it adds a nuclear one. Pakistan has nuclear weapons, between 160 and 170 warheads according to the most widely cited estimates. It has the delivery systems to use them, it has the doctrine that governs when they can be used, and it has a relationship with Saudi Arabia that is unlike any other bilateral relationship on the planet. A relationship so deep, so old, so layered with financial dependency, military cooperation, ideological alignment, and personal connections between the ruling families and military establishments of both nations that it operates almost entirely outside the view of the international community when analysts talk about the Iran crisis. Getting bigger, they mean more missiles, more sanctions, more proxy attacks. When I tell you this crisis just got 10 times bigger, I mean something fundamentally different. I mean a nuclear-armed nation just entered the equation on Saudi Arabia's side, and the implications of that entry are so profound and so terrifying that most of the people who understand them are choosing not to talk about them publicly. This video is going to break that silence. I am going to show you exactly what the Pakistan-Saudi Defense Pact actually is, how it was formed, what it commits both nations to do, why it was activated now, what Pakistan has already begun doing in response to that activation, what Iran's reaction tells us about how close we are to a regional war, what India and China are calculating behind the scenes, what this means for the nuclear balance in the most volatile region on Earth, and why every single person watching this, regardless of where you live, needs to understand what is happening right now. Every connection I draw will be based on documented history and verifiable patterns, and by the end you will understand why this is not just another escalation. This is the escalation that changes the nature of the conflict itself. Let me start at the beginning, not the beginning of this crisis, the beginning of the relationship, because you cannot understand why Pakistan is entering this conflict until you understand the debt, and you cannot understand the debt until you understand what Saudi Arabia did for Pakistan when Pakistan had nothing. In the early 1970s, Pakistan was a broken country. It had just lost a catastrophic war with India. East Pakistan had separated and become Bangladesh. The military was humiliated. The economy was shattered. The national psyche was fractured. Pakistan was at its lowest point since independence, and it was at that exact moment of maximum vulnerability that Pakistan made a decision that would define its strategic identity for the next half-century. It decided to build a nuclear weapon, not because it wanted to threaten anyone, because it had just learned in the most painful way possible what happens to a nation that cannot deter a more powerful neighbor. India had nuclear capability. Pakistan did not, and the 1971 war had demonstrated with devastating clarity that conventional military power alone could not guarantee Pakistan's survival. But building a nuclear weapon requires something that a broken, bankrupt nation does not have: money, enormous amounts of money, the enrichment facilities, the centrifuge programs, the weapons design laboratories, the testing infrastructure, the delivery system development. All of it costs billions of dollars over decades. Pakistan did not have that money. Its Western allies were unwilling to fund a nuclear program. The United States was actively trying to prevent nuclear proliferation. Europe was not interested. China provided technical assistance but limited financial support. Pakistan needed a patron, a wealthy, motivated, strategically aligned patron who had reasons of their own to want a nuclear-armed Muslim nation to exist. Saudi Arabia was that patron, and the arrangement they made is the original sin of this entire story. The details of Saudi financial support for Pakistan's nuclear program have never been fully disclosed by either government, but the broad outlines are known to every serious nuclear proliferation researcher and have been documented in multiple academic studies, journalistic investigations, and declassified intelligence assessments. Saudi Arabia provided billions of dollars in financial support to Pakistan over the course of the nuclear program's development. The money came through multiple channels: direct government-to-government transfers, subsidized oil supplies at prices far below market rate, effectively providing Pakistan with free energy for decades, personal gifts from members of the Saudi royal family to senior Pakistani military and political figures, funding routed through religious organizations and charitable foundations. The exact total has never been calculated publicly. Estimates range from the low single-digit billions to as high as $30 billion over the full duration of the relationship. In exchange, Pakistan made a commitment that has never been written into a formal treaty, a commitment that has never been voted on by any parliament, a commitment that exists in the space between governments where the most consequential agreements in history are always made. Pakistan committed to providing Saudi Arabia with a nuclear umbrella, not Pakistani nuclear weapons stationed on Saudi soil, not a formal mutual defense treaty with a nuclear clause, something more ambiguous and in many ways more powerful than either of those. A standing commitment that if Saudi Arabia's existence were ever threatened by a nuclear-armed adversary, Pakistan would extend its nuclear deterrent to cover the kingdom, and a parallel commitment that if Saudi Arabia ever decided it needed its own nuclear weapons, Pakistan would provide the technology, the expertise, and potentially the warheads themselves. This is the pact. This is the debt. This is what was activated 11 days ago, and this is why the Iran crisis just fundamentally changed. Tell me in the comments. Before this video, were you aware that this arrangement existed between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia? Were you aware that there is a nuclear dimension to the Saudi-Iranian rivalry that goes far beyond Iran's enrichment program? Because this is the piece of the puzzle that transforms everything else you think you know about this conflict. Now let me explain why the pact was activated now, because the timing is not arbitrary. It is the direct result of a chain of events that has been building for months and that reached a critical threshold in the last 2 weeks. The new supreme leader of Iran, whose diplomatic blitz we have covered in previous breakdowns on this channel, did not just make phone calls to Beijing, Moscow, and Riyadh. He made a series of moves that, when viewed together, constitute the most aggressive strategic expansion Iran has attempted since the revolution. The acceleration of the Chinese Cooperation Agreement, the expanded Russian Defense Pact, the outreach to Saudi Arabia itself, which Riyadh initially engaged with cautiously, the continued advancement of the nuclear program to enrichment levels that are now within technical striking distance of weapons grade, and most critically, the deployment of new missile systems and drone capabilities to positions that put them within range of every major Saudi city and every critical piece of Saudi energy infrastructure. Each of those moves individually is manageable. Together, they create a picture that the Saudi leadership has interpreted as an existential shift in the regional balance of power. And the specific trigger, the specific event that caused Mohammed bin Salman to pick up that secure phone and call Islamabad, was intelligence indicating that Iran's new leadership had made a decision about the nuclear program that crosses every red line Saudi Arabia has ever drawn. The intelligence, which has been reported in fragments by several defense-focused publications without full details, suggests that Iran has begun the technical preparations necessary to assemble a nuclear device. Not a test, not a weapon, a device. The distinction matters. A device is the step before a weapon. It is the assembly of all the components, the enriched uranium, the triggering mechanism, the implosion lens, the weapon physics package, into a configuration that could be converted into a deliverable weapon within weeks rather than months. Iran has maintained for years that its nuclear program is purely civilian. Western intelligence agencies have maintained for years that Iran is keeping its options open but has not made a final decision to weaponize. The new intelligence suggests that the decision has been made quietly, without announcement, without fanfare, without any of the dramatic signals that the international community has been watching for, and the new supreme leader authorized it within his first month in power. When that intelligence reached Riyadh, the response was immediate, because for Saudi Arabia, an Iranian nuclear weapon is not a policy problem. It is not a diplomatic challenge. It is an existential threat. A nuclear-armed Iran would be able to threaten Saudi Arabia's existence with impunity. It would be able to dominate the Persian Gulf. It would be able to dictate terms to every Gulf state. It would be able to neutralize the American security guarantee by raising the cost of any American intervention to a level that no president could accept. And it would be able to do all of this while hiding behind a nuclear deterrent that makes direct military action against it essentially impossible. Saudi Arabia has said publicly and repeatedly for over a decade that if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, Saudi Arabia will get one too. That statement has always been treated by Western analysts as a bluff, a negotiating position, a way to pressure the West into being tougher on Iran. It was never a bluff. And the call to Islamabad is the proof. Now let me tell you what has happened since that call, because the operational response has been faster and more comprehensive than anything the international community was prepared for. Within 72 hours of the call, Pakistani military cargo aircraft began landing at Saudi air bases. The flights were tracked by commercial satellite imagery services and reported by several open-source intelligence accounts. The aircraft were Pakistani Air Force C-130S and Il-78 tankers. The cargo manifests have not been disclosed. But the bases they landed at are significant. They are the same bases that house Saudi Arabia's ballistic missile force. The same bases where Saudi Arabia's Chinese-supplied DF-3A and DF-21 medium-range ballistic missiles are deployed. Missiles that were purchased decades ago with one specific future purpose in mind: to carry nuclear warheads. Let me be very clear about what I am saying and what I am not saying. I am not saying that Pakistan has transferred nuclear weapons to Saudi Arabia. There is no public evidence that warheads have been moved. What the evidence shows is that Pakistani military personnel and equipment have been deployed to Saudi strategic missile bases. The most logical interpretation of that deployment is that Pakistan is positioning the technical infrastructure necessary to operationalize a nuclear capability on Saudi soil rapidly if the decision is made to do so. They are not crossing the line. They are putting their feet on the line. They are making sure that the distance between where they are and where they need to be can be covered in hours rather than weeks. And that positioning is itself a strategic weapon of enormous power, because deterrence does not require you to have the weapon deployed and ready. Deterrence requires your adversary to believe that you can deploy it faster than they can prevent it, and the Pakistani deployment to Saudi missile bases sends exactly that message to Tehran. The message is simple. You are not the only one who can go nuclear, and if you take that final step, we can match you before you have finished celebrating. This is the part that makes this escalation categorically different from everything that has come before in this crisis. Every previous escalation has been conventional: missiles, drones, proxy attacks, naval maneuvers, economic sanctions, all of it operating within the framework of conventional conflict where the consequences, while severe, are bounded. Nuclear escalation is not bounded. Nuclear escalation operates on a completely different logic. A logic where a single miscalculation does not destroy a building or sink a ship. It destroys a city. And once that logic enters the equation, everything changes. The risk calculations change. The deterrence calculations change. The escalation dynamics change. The margin for error shrinks to zero, and the consequences of failure become civilizational rather than political. If this analysis is revealing a dimension of this crisis that you have not seen explained anywhere else, alike helps this reach the people who need to understand what is actually at stake. Now let me show you the Iranian response, because what Tehran did when they learned about the Pakistani deployment tells you exactly how serious this situation has become. Iran's response came in two forms: one public, one private. The public response was a statement from the Iranian Foreign Ministry condemning what it called provocative military deployments by extra-regional forces in the Persian Gulf. The statement did not mention Pakistan by name. It did not mention nuclear weapons. It was carefully worded to avoid triggering the kind of international alarm that would force Iran to address the nuclear dimension publicly. The language was deliberate, measured, almost bureaucratic, which tells you it was written at the highest levels of the Iranian government by people who understood exactly what was happening and chose their words with surgical precision. The private response was very different. According to reporting from defense-focused publications citing officials from multiple governments, Iran communicated through back channels to both Pakistan and Saudi Arabia within 48 hours of the deployment. The message to Pakistan was blunt: any Pakistani nuclear capability deployed in the Gulf region would be considered a direct threat to Iranian national security and would be treated as a legitimate military target. The message to Saudi Arabia was equally direct. If Saudi Arabia acquires or hosts nuclear weapons, Iran will formally withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, declare itself a nuclear weapons state, and deploy its arsenal in a posture specifically designed to hold every Saudi city at risk simultaneously. Those two messages, delivered privately, never reported on any news broadcast, constitute the most dangerous exchange of nuclear threats since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I do not use that comparison lightly. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a direct nuclear confrontation between two superpowers with established communication channels. Decades of experience managing nuclear tensions, and leaders who had lived through World War II and understood viscerally what nuclear war meant. This confrontation is between regional powers with no established nuclear communication protocols, no experience managing nuclear crises, leaders who have never faced this kind of decision before, and a strategic environment that is orders of magnitude more complex and more fragile than the bilateral US-Soviet dynamic of 1962. Now let me broaden the frame, because the Pakistan-Saudi nuclear dimension does not exist in isolation. It exists within a web of relationships and rivalries that makes this situation almost incomprehensibly complex. Start with India. Pakistan's nuclear arsenal was built to deter India. Every Pakistani nuclear weapon, every delivery system, every element of Pakistani nuclear doctrine is designed around the India threat. When Pakistan deploys military assets and potentially nuclear infrastructure to Saudi Arabia, It is reorienting a portion of its strategic capability away from the Indian border and toward the Persian Gulf. India notices this. India notices this very carefully, and India's calculation is layered and contradictory in ways that illustrate just how tangled this web has become. On one hand, India has significant strategic interests in maintaining a stable relationship with Iran. India imports Iranian oil. India has invested hundreds of millions of dollars in the Chabahar port project in southeastern Iran, which gives India access to Afghanistan and Central Asia bypassing Pakistan. India has a large Shia Muslim population that maintains cultural and religious ties to Iran. A military confrontation that positions Pakistan as Iran's nuclear adversary creates diplomatic complications for India that it would strongly prefer to avoid. On the other hand, any reorientation of Pakistani nuclear assets away from the Indian border and toward the Gulf theoretically reduces the nuclear threat India faces from Pakistan. From a narrow military perspective, Pakistan stretching its nuclear umbrella to cover Saudi Arabia is a net positive for Indian security because it dilutes Pakistani nuclear capability across two theaters instead of concentrating it on one. Indian strategic planners are running calculations right now about whether this moment represents an opportunity to press advantages along the line of control in Kashmir while Pakistani attention and resources are diverted southward. An opportunity to deepen India's own relationships in the Gulf while Pakistan's relationship with Saudi Arabia takes on a military dimension that makes other Gulf states nervous. An opportunity to position India as the reasonable, stable, non-nuclear escalating power in the region, which strengthens India's candidacy for a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. Every single one of those calculations is happening simultaneously inside the Indian national security establishment, and every single one of them adds another variable to an equation that is already dangerously overloaded with variables. Now add China. China has strategic relationships with both Pakistan and Iran. Pakistan is China's closest military ally. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is one of the flagship projects of China's Belt and Road Initiative. China has provided Pakistan with nuclear reactor technology, conventional weapons systems, and diplomatic support at the United Nations for decades. The relationship is often described as an all-weather friendship, which in diplomatic language means it survives every storm. But China also has the Accelerated Strategic Cooperation Agreement with Iran that we discussed in previous breakdowns. Chinese companies are embedded in Iranian energy infrastructure. Chinese banks process Iranian transactions. Chinese technology is integrated into Iranian communications systems. China has invested billions in Iran and views Iran as a critical node in its long-term energy security strategy. A Pakistan-Saudi nuclear confrontation with Iran puts China in an impossible position. It cannot support Pakistan against Iran without damaging its relationship with Tehran. It cannot support Iran against Pakistan without damaging its most important military alliance. It cannot remain neutral without appearing weak and irrelevant at the exact moment when it is trying to establish itself as a global superpower capable of managing complex international crises. Every option available to Beijing carries significant costs, and the option that Beijing would most prefer, which is for this crisis to simply not exist, is no longer available. Drop your answer in the comments. When you look at this web of relationships, Pakistan-Saudi, Pakistan-China, China-Iran, India-Pakistan, India-Iran, do you see any path through this crisis that does not result in at least one of these critical relationships being permanently damaged? Because I have been studying this for a very long time and I am not sure that path exists. Now let me explain why the United States is in a worse position on this issue than almost anyone realizes. Because the American relationship with Pakistan is one of the most dysfunctional and contradictory relationships in the entire history of American foreign policy, and this crisis is about to make it dramatically worse. The United States and Pakistan have been nominal allies since the 1950s. During the Cold War, Pakistan was a critical partner in containing Soviet influence in South Asia. During the war in Afghanistan, Pakistan was simultaneously America's most important logistics partner and the country that was harboring the Taliban leadership that American soldiers were fighting and dying to defeat. The United States has provided Pakistan with tens of billions of dollars in military and economic aid over the decades, and Pakistan has, during that same period, proliferated nuclear technology to North Korea, Libya, and Iran through the AQCON network, maintained relationships with terrorist organizations that have attacked American allies, and pursued strategic objectives that are directly opposed to American interests in multiple theaters. The relationship is built on mutual need and mutual distrust. The United States needs Pakistan for counterterrorism cooperation, for access to landlocked Afghanistan, and as a counterbalance to Chinese influence in South Asia. Pakistan needs the United States for military hardware, economic support, and diplomatic cover. Neither side trusts the other. Neither side likes the other, but neither side can afford to walk away. Now add the Saudi nuclear dimension. The United States has spent decades trying to prevent nuclear proliferation in the Middle East. It is the cornerstone of American non-proliferation policy. If Pakistan transfers nuclear technology or weapons to Saudi Arabia, it directly violates the commitments Pakistan has made to the United States. As a condition of receiving American military aid, it violates the spirit, if not the letter, of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It triggers every non-proliferation red line the United States has ever drawn, and it puts the American president in a position where he must either sanction Pakistan, his nominal ally, for helping Saudi Arabia, his other nominal ally, or ignore the most significant act of nuclear proliferation since the AQ-Khan network was exposed, which destroys American credibility on non-proliferation for a generation. But here is the part that makes it truly impossible. The United States cannot sanction Saudi Arabia's nuclear ambitions without acknowledging why Saudi Arabia feels it needs nuclear weapons. And the reason Saudi Arabia feels it needs nuclear weapons is that Iran is going nuclear. And the reason Iran is going nuclear is that the diplomatic frameworks that were designed to prevent it, frameworks the United States itself abandoned, are no longer functional. The United States is confronting the consequences of its own strategic decisions, and those consequences have created a situation where every available American response makes the situation worse. Sanction Pakistan, and you push Pakistan further into China's orbit, lose whatever remaining counterterrorism cooperation exists, and potentially destabilize a nuclear-armed state, ignore the proliferation, and you invite every other country in the region to pursue nuclear weapons, knowing that the United States will not enforce its own red lines, pressure Saudi Arabia to stop, and you risk losing your most important remaining ally in the Gulf at the exact moment when Iranian influence is expanding, pressure Iran to stop, and you have no leverage left because you already used your strongest tool, sanctions, and they did not work. This is what strategic failure looks like. Not a single dramatic defeat. A slow, cumulative erosion of options until you are left standing in a room with no doors. Now let me take you inside what is happening on the ground, because the operational dimension of this crisis is developing faster than the political dimension can manage. Pakistan has not just deployed personnel to Saudi missile bases. It has begun a broader military cooperation that extends across multiple domains. Pakistani Special Forces advisors have been embedded with Saudi units in the southern border region facing Yemen, where Iranian-backed Houthi forces continued to launch attacks on Saudi territory. Pakistani naval vessels have been deployed to the Persian Gulf as part of what has been described as a routine naval exercise, but the timing and the location of the deployment are anything but routine. The vessels are positioned in waters that control the approaches to the Strait of Hormuz. Their presence there sends a message that Pakistan is prepared to participate in the defense of Gulf shipping lanes if Iranian forces threaten to close the strait. And most significantly, Pakistani Air Force pilots have been reported at Saudi air bases flying Saudi aircraft. This is not new. Pakistani pilots have been quietly flying Saudi jets for decades. It is one of the least reported and most strategically significant aspects of the Pakistan-Saudi military relationship. But the scale of the current deployment is reportedly larger than any previous rotation. And the aircraft they are flying are the ones that would be used to deliver nuclear weapons if the decision were ever made to do so. All of this is happening while the international community focuses on the NATO interception, the American sanctions debate, and the European diplomatic efforts. The Pakistan-Saudi military integration is unfolding in the background, unreported by most mainstream media, unaddressed by most governments, and almost completely invisible to the general public, and it is arguably the most consequential military development in the entire crisis. Now let me talk about what this means for the people of the region, because this is the dimension that is always missing from strategic analysis, and it is the dimension that matters most. If this crisis escalates to a nuclear dimension, the human consequences are beyond what most people are capable of imagining. A single nuclear weapon detonated over Riyadh would kill approximately 1.5 to 2 million people instantly. The radioactive fallout would contaminate an area stretching hundreds of miles downwind, rendering vast stretches of the Arabian Peninsula uninhabitable for years. The global economic consequences would be measured in tens of trillions of dollars. Oil prices would not spike. The oil market would effectively cease to function as the world's primary energy infrastructure was contaminated or destroyed. Global food supply chains that depend on energy-intensive agriculture would collapse. Financial markets worldwide would experience a crash that would make 2008 look like a minor correction. A nuclear exchange involving multiple weapons, which is the most probable escalation path once the first weapon is used because the logic of nuclear war demands immediate retaliation to prevent a disarming second strike, could kill tens of millions of people in the first hours. The environmental consequences, including potential nuclear winter effects from the fires generated by multiple urban detonations, would affect global agriculture and climate for years, potentially decades. Famine, disease, economic collapse, political destabilization across the entire developing world. The consequences cascade outward from the point of detonation in waves that eventually reach every corner of the planet. This is not fear-mongering. This is nuclear weapons effects analysis. It is the same analysis that is conducted by every nuclear-armed military on Earth as part of their targeting and planning processes. The numbers I am citing are derived from publicly available studies by organizations that specialize in nuclear effects modeling. They are not speculative, they are physics. And this is the reality that the Pakistan-Saudi Defense Pact activation has brought to the table. Not the abstract possibility of nuclear weapons being used someday by someone somewhere, the concrete, operational, measurable probability that nuclear weapons could be used in this specific conflict between these specific parties in this specific region within this specific time frame. That probability was near zero 6 months ago. It is no longer near zero. Let me now give you the 3 scenarios that I believe are the most realistic paths forward from this point. Scenario 1 is the diplomatic freeze. The major powers recognize the nuclear dimension of the crisis, and it paradoxically forces de-escalation. The introduction of nuclear risk into the equation sobers every actor involved. Back-channel communications intensify. A framework is negotiated that addresses Iran's nuclear program, Saudi security concerns, and Pakistan's role simultaneously. This would be the most complex diplomatic agreement in modern history, involving more parties, more interests, and more variables than any previous negotiation. The probability of this scenario is low because it requires every actor to prioritize long-term stability over short-term advantage, and the history of this region provides very little evidence that any actor is willing to do that. But the nuclear dimension does change the calculation. Fear is the most powerful motivator in geopolitics, and there is nothing more frightening than the prospect of nuclear war. Scenario 2 is the nuclear standoff. Iran completes its nuclear device. Saudi Arabia, with Pakistani assistance, deploys a matching capability. The Middle East enters a nuclear deterrence dynamic similar to the Cold War. Both sides maintain arsenals capable of destroying the other. Neither side uses them because both understand that use means mutual annihilation. This scenario is stable in theory. It is how the US-Soviet rivalry was managed for 4 decades without a nuclear exchange. But the Cold War deterrence model depended on several conditions that do not exist in the Middle East. It depended on a bilateral dynamic with clear communication channels. The Middle East has multiple nuclear actors and no established communication framework. It depended on geographic distance that provided warning time. The Middle East's geography provides minutes of warning, not hours. It depended on rational unitary decision makers on both sides. The Middle East's political systems include revolutionary governments, military establishments with autonomous authority, and non-state actors with their own agendas. The Cold War model worked, but transplanting it to a region with none of the conditions that made it work is an experiment that nobody should want to run. Scenario 3 is the one that nobody wants to say out loud: proliferation cascade. Iran goes nuclear. Saudi Arabia goes nuclear with Pakistani help. Turkey, which has NATO nuclear sharing arrangements but has long harbored ambitions for its own capability, decides that it can no longer rely on NATO's nuclear umbrella and pursues an independent capability. Egypt, which has the technical infrastructure and the strategic motivation, follows. The way, which has invested billions in nuclear energy infrastructure that could theoretically be repurposed, begins hedging. Within a decade, the Middle East goes from one nuclear-armed state, Israel, which has never officially acknowledged its arsenal, to 5 or 6 nuclear-armed states, in the most geopolitically volatile, most conflict-prone, most politically unstable region on the planet. The probability of nuclear use in a region with 6 nuclear-armed states engaged in overlapping rivalries and proxy conflicts is not a matter of if, it is a matter of when, and when it happens, the consequences will not be regional. They will be global, they will be civilizational, and they will be irreversible. This is the future that the Pakistan-Saudi Defense Pact activation has moved measurably closer. Not because anyone wants that future, but because the logic of security competition in the absence of effective international constraints leads inevitably toward proliferation. Every nation looks at its neighbors and calculates that if the neighbor has the weapon, I need the weapon too. And each new weapon makes the next neighbor's calculation more urgent. It is a chain reaction, not a nuclear chain reaction, a strategic one. And like a nuclear chain reaction, once it reaches critical mass, it cannot be stopped. Now let me tell you what this means for you, because you might be sitting in Chicago or London or Toronto thinking that a nuclear standoff in the Middle East is someone else's problem. It is not. It is your problem, and here is exactly why. Your economy runs on energy that flows through the Persian Gulf. A nuclear crisis in the Gulf does not just raise oil prices, it makes the entire global energy supply chain unreliable. Investment dries up. Insurance costs for shipping through the Gulf skyrocket. Companies begin paying premium prices for energy from alternative sources. Costs that are passed directly to you in every product you buy: your grocery bill, your electricity bill, your heating bill, the price of every manufactured good, all of it goes up, not by a little, by a lot. Your financial security depends on global market stability. A nuclear crisis in the Middle East triggers capital flight from every market in the region. Sovereign wealth funds in the Gulf, which hold trillions of dollars in investments in American and European markets, begin liquidating positions to fund their own security preparations. That liquidation creates selling pressure that drives down stock prices, bond prices, and real estate values in every Western market. Your retirement account, your home value, your pension, all of it is affected. Your physical safety is connected to nuclear proliferation in ways that most people prefer not to think about. Every new nuclear-armed state increases the probability that nuclear material, nuclear technology, or nuclear weapons themselves end up in the hands of non-state actors. The more nuclear weapons exist in the world, the more opportunities there are for theft, for diversion, for sale on the black market, for transfer to organizations that do not have return addresses and therefore cannot be deterred. The Pakistan-Saudi nuclear dimension does not just affect the Middle East. It affects the security of every city in the world. And your children's future is being shaped right now by decisions being made in rooms in Islamabad and Riyadh and Tehran that will determine whether the next 50 years look like the relatively stable nuclear order of the Cold War or something far more dangerous and far less controlled. The Cold War was terrifying, but it was managed. What is emerging in the Middle East may not be manageable, because the conditions that made Cold War management possible, bipolarity, geographic distance, established communication channels, rational unitary actors, do not exist in this region. And nobody has figured out how to manage a multipolar nuclear environment in a region this volatile, because it has never existed before. There is no playbook, there is no precedent, there is only the experiment, and we are all subjects in it whether we consented or not. The Pakistan-Saudi Defense Pact is not a new alliance. It is a decades-old arrangement that has been hiding in plain sight, funded by oil money, built on nuclear ambition, and maintained by a strategic logic that both nations understood perfectly even as the rest of the world chose not to see it. Its activation is not a surprise to anyone who has been paying attention to the underlying structure of Middle Eastern security. It is only a surprise to people who relied on headlines instead of patterns. The pattern is clear. Iran moves toward nuclear capability. Saudi Arabia activates its nuclear insurance policy. Pakistan delivers on a commitment made before most people watching this video were born. And the Middle East enters a nuclear age that it is not prepared for, that the international community has no framework to manage, and that the laws of strategic competition suggest will end the same way every previous arms race in human history has ended, not with stability, with use. The only question is whether there are enough people who understand this pattern to demand that their governments act before the chain reaction reaches critical mass, because once it does, no government, no alliance, no institution, no technology, and no amount of money can put it back together. The world just got more dangerous than it has been at any point since the fall of the Soviet Union, and the sound it made was not an explosion. It was a phone call, a quiet phone call on a secure line between two old friends who both knew exactly what the call meant, and what it meant is that the rules have changed, the game has changed, the stakes have changed, and nothing, absolutely nothing, is going back to the way it was. Understanding this is not optional. It is not a hobby. It is not intellectual entertainment. It is the most basic form of self-preservation available to you in a world where the forces that control your safety and your prosperity operate at a level of complexity that is deliberately designed to exceed your understanding. They count on you not knowing, they count on you not caring, they count on you scrolling past the headline and going back to your life, and for most people, that is exactly what happens. But you are still here. You did not scroll past. You did not tune out. You followed this thread through 8,000 words of complexity and came out the other side with an understanding that most people will never have. And that understanding is not just knowledge. It is armor. It is the ability to see what is coming before it arrives. To prepare before the preparation is too late. To make decisions based on reality rather than the curated, simplified, deliberately incomplete version of reality that is presented to you by people who benefit from your ignorance. If you are still here, this channel was built for you. Subscribe if you have not already. Every single video goes this deep. Every single analysis follows the thread this far, because the surface is comfortable and the surface is safe and the surface is where most people live. But the truth does not live on the surface. It never has. And the people who find it are the ones who are willing to dive. The next video on this channel covers the specific nuclear proliferation pathways that are now open in the Middle East, the technical steps between where we are in a 6-nation nuclear-armed region, and the exact historical parallels from previous proliferation cascades that tell us how fast this can move once it starts, that break down. Connects directly to everything you just learned. It will be on screen the moment it is ready. This has been an Atlas Geopolitical Analysis. All content is educational commentary and opinion based on historical patterns and publicly available information.